We start with that breaking news from Capitol Hill with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Phil Rucker, White House bureau chief for the Washington Post, is back. Former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance joins us. Toronto Star Washington bureau chief Daniel Dale is at the table, as are Vanity Fair senior reporter Emily Jane Fox and Donnie Deutsch. Let me start with you, Phil Rucker. Jay Sekulow, as I was reading that, I was reminded that Jay Sekulow also crafted the president's responses to Robert Mueller's questions. And I'm sure that if he had any hand in how Michael Cohen answered questions about negotiations over Trump Tower Moscow, Robert Mueller's known that for a long time.
Yeah, that's a good point, Nicole. I think Robert Mueller knows a lot of the things that Michael Cohen is alleging with congressional investigators. I would love to see the actual documents that he's provided to the investigators and see what those notes actually are. As you were saying, Jay Sekulow has denied that he participated in or advised on these edits, and you know, it's a bit of a he said situation here. But what we're seeing with Cohen is, again, it's day after day of new revelations that he's making before Congress. There was the extraordinary public testimony last week, but it's been so much more than that, and he is continuing to provide new claims and new pieces of information to these congressional investigators, perhaps to prove his worth as a cooperating witness to the prosecutors up in New York.
The person to whom he has already proven his worth is Robert Mueller. I was reminded today that he had a cooperation agreement from Mueller at the time of sentencing and not the Southern District of New York. So the White House, it would seem, Phil Rucker, is in a bit of a jam. And if you look at all of the knots they've tied themselves in with Rudy Giuliani's television appearances, it would appear that Trump, in answers crafted by Jay Sekulow, gave a different answer than the false testimony Cohen gave, for which he was charged and ultimately pleaded guilty. I mean, this does seem like, if at best for this White House, a flashpoint.
I think everything involving Michael Cohen is at best a flashpoint, and at worst much worse than a flashpoint. I mean, this is not a good situation for the White House, because they have the president's former attorney before Congress right now, providing information that conflicts with what the president's own current legal team has said, that conflicts with what the president himself has said, and conflicts with what the president's sort of White House, official government staff have said about these events.
Joyce, if all we get to is these lies, I feel like it would be an hour well spent. We know that the government now believes Michael Cohen's corrected testimony. He's going to jail. He went back to Congress because he corrected that lie he told about the duration of negotiations between Trump Organization and the highest levels of the Russian government over building Trump Tower Moscow. He showed today in the House Intel Committee something that surely Robert Mueller already had. Robert Mueller, after seeing everything Cohen had, we don't necessarily know this was among what Mueller saw, gave him a cooperation agreement. So either found him credible or found him helpful. Do you think that what the House committee saw today is important?
I think it has to be important, and you're absolutely right that it's been in Mueller's hands for a long time. I know you've heard other prosecutors as well as me say that the key to Cohen is corroboration. Even if he has incentives to be truthful at this point in time, he only damages himself if he lies further. He's still not a witness you can believe without corroboration. And so bringing in notes, bringing in checks is critical. I'm in the Phil Rucker camp on this. I'd like to see exactly what's in those notes, those edits, before I'd be willing to say how significant they are. But if, for instance, they are changes that are tracked in Word that link back to Sekulow, and if it can be proven that that was actually him, not someone else editing for him, or if they're in handwriting that can be linked to individuals, this evidence, again, is building blocks in a chain that is equally useful for Mueller and for the folks up on Capitol Hill.
Emily, it is an interesting strategy that Michael Cohen has turned to after being smeared and branded, and I guess he's been convicted of lying. He is now not asking us to believe him, but showing us the documents. They're the 6 checks that we mentioned at the top of the show in the New York Times, and we'll get to all of those in a minute. That's some incredible reporting that on a normal day would lead this show for at least one day, maybe 2. But this edited testimony to me seems like something he knew he had. He could have provided it last week. Any understanding or sense or insights into why it's coming out today, why the checks are in the New York Times today?
So I think all of this came together at the last minute. I had reported last week that in the days leading up to his public testimony, he was down in the storage unit in his building going through these 9 boxes that were returned to him from the FBI when they seized them from his apartment last April. And that is when he found, or it jogged his memory of an email correspondence that he had in those boxes, that there were these checks. And he went to his bank, and the check that he had with Don Jr.'s signature on it came through the day before the public testimony. So he was back combing through documents this week, and we just published a story this afternoon in Vanity Fair explaining what he's been doing since the testimony, and a lot of it has been another document dive. And I think investigators last week in both closed doors hearings were asking him for specific things, and that's what he went back in looking for this week. I think there are edits among the documents he's bringing today and communications about the edits.
So that's interesting. I haven't seen that reported in our account or in others. But you're reporting that it's not just, as Joyce referenced, track changes inside the testimony, but other communications, emails or texts or other communications about what he would say?
I have not seen the actual edits, so I don't know what is communicated on those or if there are track changes, but it's my understanding from my reporting that there is communication about what should be edited amongst people who are representing various interested parties.
And they had a joint defense agreement, Donnie. So this is, again, where it may be the cover-up, not the crime, that gets them in trouble. They were operating under a joint defense agreement. Their lawyers had the right to talk. If they are now lying, if Jay Sekulow provided one set of answers for Michael Cohen to read off or testify to before Congress and another one, we will find out about that. We will learn that.
Let's use a little common sense, and Joyce touched on this about Michael's mindset going into the testimony. If Michael could have never done this, he would have been thrilled to do it because he could only lose. I mean, this is a guy that's looking at 3 years jail time. His biggest fear is 3 years and a day. One untruth, one slight untruth.
New charges.
New charges. So do you think that this guy is in any way going to lie? He didn't need that one extra thumb on the scale and say, oh, and by the way, on the most pivotal issue of all, the timing of Russia, the president and the president's attorney had me make edits. Think about the possibility that he was, yeah, I'm going to make that up. I think that's a good thing to make up. It defies any logic. Along with Emily, I don't know exactly where he is, but I do remember him talking to me about edits. It's interesting the way Emily talks about the chain of events of the last few days. Emily spent a lot of time with him over the last year or two. I have also. It's amazing how all of a sudden you'll be in a conversation with him and go, oh, wait a second. Wait, there was that guy that sent me, this is 10 years of his life. And, 4 million documents. So it is, I know for some people going home go, oh, so now he's just finding the documents. This is just a never-ending thing. The people that believe Michael...
Wait, let me just underscore that. And they're also, they're boxes of documents that federal prosecutors have already culled through.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are the ones that were sent back
to him.
But the checks were not in there. The checks were, he had to go to his bank. There was an email in the documents that referred to the payment, and he said, oh, I should get copies of those checks from the bank. And so you're dealing with someone, Donnie is completely right here, who has done a lot of things that he wouldn't necessarily think were worth bringing up because he's so close to it. Someone who's
committed a lot of crimes.
Very keyed into the situation. Explained it to me last week that, like, when your nose is right up against the glass, you don't necessarily notice what you're looking into. And his lawyers spent the weeks leading up to his testimony last week being like, let's go through everything to see what you could possibly remember.
I want to go through all the checks. We have all of the 6 new checks that are out. New reporting in the New York Times illustrates how the president's hush money operation collided routinely with both his official duties as president and major flashpoints in Robert Mueller's Russia investigation. As the New York Times lays it out, starting February 14th, 2017, the day after Trump's national security advisor Mike Flynn resigned, and the day Trump pressured Jim Comey to let the Flynn investigation go, his trust cut Michael Cohen a check for $70,000. On March 17th, Trump, playing president, hosted German Chancellor Angela Merkel in the Oval Office. something she won't soon forget, as his trust is writing Cohen another check for $35,000. May 23rd, as Trump is on an overseas trip meeting with world leaders trying to negotiate peace between Israel and Palestine, he finds the time to personally sign a $35,000 check to Cohen, this time out of his own funds. On August 1st, we learned Trump personally dictated the false statement about the Trump Tower meeting on Air Force One. Trump signs another check that same day. September 12th, the White House says the Justice Department should consider prosecuting Comey. Trump, you guessed it, found time to write another check. October 18th, embroiled in controversy over his phone call to the widow of LaDavid T. Johnson, Trump signs a check, hush money check number 6 that we know of. November 21st, Trump pardons a turkey, publicly defends Roy Moore, speaks by phone to Vladimir Putin. He also, get it, guys, signs a check to Michael Cohen for $35,000. And finally, on December 5th, a momentous day in U.S. foreign policy, Trump declares that the American embassy in Israel will move to Jerusalem and signs a check to Michael Cohen that very same day. Just 4 months later, the FBI raids the home and offices of Michael Cohen as part of a massive investigation into this ongoing scheme, the raid the president has famously called an attack on our country. And fast forward to December, the president's named as Individual 1 for his role in directing the hush money scheme that Michael Cohen is now in part going to jail for.
Yeah, and so, the president's defenders will say this stuff might be unseemly, involves a porn performer or whatever, but it's personal. And I think what the Times has shown and Cohen has shown by providing these checks is that, it wasn't simply personal. This was a relatively routine part of his day, official days. He wasn't at Mar-a-Lago. I think the president's defenders, though, will still say, look, how long does it take to write a check? You can pardon a turkey and write a check. I
want to bring up something about Trump and signing checks. No, Trump is notorious for not paying. At this point, Michael was kind of cut loose to some degree. If there was not an urgency to those checks, Michael would still be trying to get those checks right now. And there's 10,000 contractors online still waiting for their checks. So,
well, it's such a good point because Phil Rucker, Cohen testified last week, and you were in parts unknown. You were in Hanoi, but Cohen testified to just being happy to get his check. Trump said the check's in the mail, and Cohen testified. And it sort of goes to Donnie's point. He was happy to be paid. I mean, this was a man.
He should be
paying his bills on time.
Yeah, and Donald Trump, as a real estate developer, famously didn't pay some of his contractors, and people who installed things in his building never got their bills paid. So Cohen should be pleased to be paid. I will say, we talk a lot on his show about what President Trump does in his executive time and how he occupies the executive time. We now know it's not just watching TV; it's also writing hush money payment checks for affairs. And one thing, Nicole, I think we ought to underscore from that earlier conversation about the Cohen documents and who's telling the truth here, that we just have to keep in mind that nobody here is a reliable narrator. We've seen time and again the president saying things that are not true, his lawyers saying things that are not true, Cohen saying things that are not true, and it's a real challenge for all of us to try to figure out what the truth is here, and we should just keep that in mind.
Let me come back to you on that, Daniel Dale. I mean, the president, up to, I think he's cracked the 10,000 lie mark. So there's no one who lies more than Trump. No. So even though Cohen is the one going to jail for lying, I don't think there's anyone that lies more than Trump in this story, is there?
Yeah, it's hard for Trump to win a credibility battle with anyone, even a convicted liar. Trump is not a felonious liar at this point in his life. But no. And so, Donald Trump finds it difficult to convince anyone that he is the truthful person in any battle. He told 60 false claims in one speech on Saturday.
Oh, you know what? I want you to make this point, because I saw you make this point on Twitter, and it's a good admonition to all of us. So you tweeted about the number of lies in that speech and how they almost go unnoticed at this point.
Yeah, so Trump spoke for 2 hours at CPAC, the conservative conference. He made 60 false claims in one speech. But if you were to read most of the coverage of that speech, those false claims aren't mentioned or only mentioned.
I covered it yesterday as, is incompetent. I didn't even really.
Yeah, and so even sometimes just his policy or claims are covered, his attacks on Mueller or his immigration comments are covered. Sometimes people will say, oh, he rambled, he was erratic. But I think the foremost thing about these speeches is that the president is often been and was then incessantly dishonest. And I think that should always be the focus of the coverage when appropriate.
This brings up some more reporting that I want to ask everybody about. Phil Rucker, your paper on the record today with the he said, to borrow your phrase, about Michael Cohen and pardons. The he said on the Cohen side, as your colleagues report, is Cohen alleging that a pardon was dangled in front of him, that he did not seek one. The Trump camp's position, as reported by your paper, and jump in if I get this wrong, is that they sought one. This seems, based on your analysis and Daniel's and everyone's, irreconcilable. But to Donnie's point, what motive would Cohen have to go in and lie about the pardon conversation in his testimony before reporting to prison?
Yeah, Nicole, so a couple things that are not entirely clear in our reporting, and it's because I don't think Cohen has been very specific in his testimony behind closed doors to members of Congress. It's not clear the specific elements of any sort of dangled pardon. Was the pardon actually offered? Was something else said that Cohen interpreted as a pardon being offered? There are conflicting stories there. I talked yesterday to Rudy Giuliani, the president's sort of public-facing attorney, about this, and he said, look, I can't get into conversations that I've had with other lawyers, but I will say that the president has never contemplated a pardon during this process for Cohen or for anybody else for that matter. So the lawyers are saying there was never any real offer of a pardon. The question is, what did Cohen hear? What did he interpret? And what is he now telling congressional investigators?
Can we stop on what Phil said? And we touched on this yesterday, that Rudy Giuliani has said the president has never considered a pardon for anybody. The ultimate autocrat with the ultimate autocratic tool, the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. He sees this unfolding. And this man, Mr. 10,000 Lie, has never contemplated
his lawyer
a
dangled
pardon.
them in front of Manafort and Flynn.
It's incomprehensible, the things that come out of these people's mouths.
Joyce, I want to play you something. Now that Cohen's in the news, we're talking about his credibility. We're talking about who finds him credible. Let me show you what he said about his frequency of contact with SDNY in his testimony last week.
So the committee understands that you've been in contact with the Southern District of New York. Is that true?
I am in constant contact with the Southern District of New York regarding ongoing investigations.
Ever since those words came out of his mouth, I've been trying to understand what he's in constant contact about. But I have learned that he is in a different place, that when he was sentenced in December, as I mentioned before, he had a cooperation agreement with Mueller, not SDNY. That relationship, and Donnie has said this on this show before, Emily has reported this out too, that relationship has totally changed. What makes a prosecutor either believe someone suggested that perhaps some of his testimony was corroborated. Another individual said there could have been a breakthrough. What could be going on between Cohen and SDNY?
We don't know for certain that SDNY prosecutors have changed their minds, that they do find Cohen to be believable. But they are, for him, the gatekeeper. They're the people that he has to work through if he wants to have his sentence reduced. So he should have a lot of motivation to establish that he's being truthful with them. And the way he does that is by providing corroboration, leading them to other witnesses who can confirm him, or even public record information. Some of the timeline information might be helpful. So it seems likely to me that what's going on is he is knocking on their door as opposed to the other way around. And as they continue to expand their investigations, so many different facets of the Trump organization, and I mean that loosely, not the business organization, but everything Trump now seems to be coming under scrutiny because there is so much indicia of criminal conduct. The areas where Cohen can cooperate are necessarily expanding, and it may be that he's finally hit some pay dirt with SDNY.
What leads are you following about what this relationship is yielding between Cohen and SDNY?
Well, I think all you have to look at is how deferential he was to the Southern District last week in the public hearing. There were a number of things that I think would have been even bigger blockbusters than we got had he not stopped himself and said, look, these are things that I don't want to go into because they're part of investigations that are ongoing in the Southern District of New York. So he seemed very deferential to me.
And you've got the reporting on the inaugural committee. Any sense that that's something he was involved in?
It all stemmed from the recording that was captured from his apartment, or hotel room, or office, whichever one it was, that was him talking with Stephanie Winston Wolkoff about wrongdoing that was ongoing throughout the process of the inauguration. So he started that. I don't know how much he in particular has to offer about the inauguration, but there are a number of things that he witnessed. There are what came up last week with insurance brokers, what came up last week with bankers, with inflating and deflating wealth as it suited him. Those are all things that I could imagine would be juicy to investigators. And just one thing. 2 dates of those checks that the Times reported about stood out to me. The first was that the first check was cut on Valentine's Day. So happy
He was
Valentine's
super
Day.
busy that day.
And the last one was December 5th, 2017. And I believe on December 7th of that year, Cohen was at the White House for the Hanukkah party with his family. And so this was not a man who was totally cut loose. And they began talking again once the Stormy Daniels news broke about a month later. And you know, for a time it was keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer, and then once the raid happened.
Wasn't that close? Even when they were still kind of connected at that point, it was
Falling apart.
It was not that close, and then there was a dividing moment. As far as SDNY, look at every issue that's coming up, and you can use your imagination back to this. You know, every business entity, every insurance, one after the other, and I think I wouldn't be surprised with the AG also is going to become very good friends with it going forward. So
many lies, so little time.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.